Looking at funeral customs during the colonial era offers us a surprising insight into colonial society in general. Here's what it may have been like to witness a funeral in the American colonies. In an era before embalming or even consistent refrigeration, deceased Americans were subject to a fast-paced progression of washing, viewing by family and community members, and burial within a week or so. If you died during an especially cold spell, you might have a couple of extra days, but funerals at the time were far from a lingering process. And if a community was in the middle of an especially stressful period, funerals might be truncated or even skipped altogether. In colonial Virginia, the settlers at Jamestown faced a stark reality during the winter of 1609 to 1610 in what widely became known as the Starving Time.
Famine compelled us wholly to devour those hogs, dogs, and horses that were then in the colony.
Typically, the dead of this period were buried in simple shrouds, sometimes in coffins, and nearly always in purpose-dug graves. The burials from that winter show some people were interred in a hurry, still wearing their clothes or awkwardly crammed into two small graves. Survivors wrote that some of the dead were even exhumed to be eaten, as cut marks on at least one skeleton made clear. Victims of a March 1622 tribal uprising at the Martin's Hundred settlement in Virginia were also hastily buried without coffins or shrouds. However, historical evidence indicates that they were at least placed in graves and given some degree of remembrance. Because so many of early New England communities were desperate to avoid any whiff of Catholicism, Puritan funerals were largely silent. Early settlements in places like Ipswich, Massachusetts didn't offer remembrances like eulogies or sermons related to the deceased. After a procession to the graveyard, a few words may have been uttered, but that was about it. If someone was of sufficiently high standing, a sermon might be preached at some point after their death, but it would have been folded into a regular service lest anyone think the deceased was too special. But even the seemingly immovable Puritans changed as time went on. Perhaps the silences started to get awkward, or mourners felt that a sober, closed-lipped service wasn't good enough for their loved one. As the 17th century came to a close, people indulged more in remembrances, eulogies, special sermons, and even sometimes embalmed the dead to give everyone more time to mark the occasion of someone's passing. If you were a Puritan mourner looking for a bit of comfort at an early colonial funeral, you would have been better off looking somewhere else. English Puritan colonists have an uneasy relationship with the concepts of God, death, and the afterlife. Sure, they believed in an almighty deity and a heaven that held eternal bliss for its occupants. They also believed that most people went to eternal torment in hell after death. Moreover, they claimed that God had already decided who would go where before they were even born, a Calvinist doctrine known as predestination. But no one knew for sure if they were one of the heaven-bound elect, so anxiety about sin and the afterlife was still rampant. Funerals were an opportunity for preachers to thunder on about the inherently sinful nature of humanity and leave everyone in the congregation fretting about their fate. And there would be no heartfelt eulogies focusing on the deceased. According to the strict Calvinist views of early American Puritans, no one but God could say for certain where a dead person's soul ended up.
Greetings, sinner.
Even prominent religious figures like Minister Increase Mather went to their deathbeds racked with anxiety over the question. Those left behind at the funeral fared little better. Of course, Puritans weren't the only North American colonists. From what's now Albany, New York, down to Delaware, the Dutch put down roots beginning in the early years of the 17th century. Naturally, they brought many customs with them, including a funeral tradition that had a grim figure appearing on the doorstep. The spectral personage was actually a messenger dressed all in black, known as an aanspreker. His job was to dress up, go from home to home, and formally invite members of a household to a funeral. Given that you simply didn't attend a funeral without being asked first, unless you wanted to completely tank your social standing, the aanspreker was a vital component of funerals and mourning in New Amsterdam. Though they started off as general workers who also did most of the grave digging and burial ground maintenance, they eventually became local minor officials who could command a decent fee for hoofing it out to far-flung homes in their formal wear. And of course, if an aanspreker was good, why not 2 or even more? For especially wealthy dead folks in later decades of the colonial period, a whole team of inviters might parade through town, ostentatiously mourning and delivering the news. Today, funeral processions might include a casket carried by people, but they typically only make a short walk from the service to a waiting hearse. But early New England colonists didn't have cars. They didn't even necessarily have a horse and wagon. Instead, Puritans were more likely to carry the coffin by hand from the service to the graveyard. Sometimes a double set of pallbearers might be used, a group of younger men to do the heavy lifting, while elders walked alongside carrying the edge of the cloth pall draped over the coffin.
Are we there yet?
Depending on the community, it could be quite a walk, even if one wasn't carrying a body. If it was a long enough journey, the pallbearers might switch out with the second team halfway. Sometimes they'd find a spot to set down the deceased while they rested before taking up the coffin again. Initially, the dead of colonial America were laid beneath simple wooden markers, or their graves might be marked by nothing at all. This was in line with the unadorned Puritan aesthetic, but eventually even many Puritans had enough of the hardline way of things. Gradually, grave markers in the colonies began to get more spendy, transforming from rough-hewn slabs of stone to intricate monuments crafted by master stone carvers. They also tended to include stark reminders of mortality, like the winged skull commonly known as a death's head, sometimes also shown with crossed bones. Soon, other imagery entered the mix, including hourglasses, coffins, and inscriptions that went from a simple name and set of dates to reminders of the reader's looming death, including the ever-popular memento mori. As time went on, later monuments softened the message and got downright flowery, with poetic epitaphs and more comforting images of willows, urns, and baby-faced cherubs. As the North American colonies became more prosperous, it was possible for skilled stone carvers to build a serious reputation. Many developed a unique style that researchers have been able to link to names and workshops throughout New England and beyond. Of course, Europeans weren't the only people who lived in the Americas during the colonial period. Long before they arrived, the territory was already occupied by a vast array of indigenous tribes. And just like everyone else on the planet, Native Americans of the era had their own unique funeral practices. In 1588, Thomas Harriot wrote that the indigenous people of Roanoke, Virginia believed in a heavenly afterlife for the good and a burning pit set aside for the bad. He also mentioned that high-ranking members of the tribe received special burials, much like Theodore de Bry noted in 1590 when he created an illustration of a burial temple set aside for the elite of the Algonquin tribe. Nearly 50 years later, Thomas Morton chronicled some of the funeral practices of New England tribes, most likely the Wampanoag people. Morton noted that the people living near Plymouth, Massachusetts reinforced the graves of elite tribal members with wooden planks, painted their faces black in mourning, and once avoided even talking about the dead, although that taboo softened after coming into contact with European colonists. They also marked higher-class burial spots with a special cloth. When Pilgrim colonists removed the cloth over a chieftain mother's grave, a fight ensued over the desecration of a burial. Though it may seem like the highly religious, conservative Puritans dominated the colonial period, not everyone was on board. There were the Pilgrims, who arrived about a decade before the Puritans, and Quakers. There was even a small population of Catholic settlers in British colonies, as well as the indigenous people and enslaved Africans who had their own funeral customs. It's no wonder that colonial funerals soon began to evolve from the unadorned ceremonies favored by Puritans. By 1717, the death of Waitstill Winthrop, grandson of Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop, was an occasion for much pomp. His funeral procession included drummers, military personnel with shiny new weapons, and expensive gifts. Waitstill's funeral cost more than £600, which was 1/5 of his estate, and exceeded the annual tax revenue of pretty much everywhere else in the colonies outside of Boston. As with other upper-class funerals, family members of Winthrop may have worn black mourning clothes, while the deceased might now be conveyed to the graveyard by a carriage outfitted with a team of horses specially dressed in black for the occasion. Funerals were also getting louder. Besides drums, there might be trumpets, the tolling of bells, and the firing of guns. In fact, John Winthrop's funeral was reportedly marked by rounds fired over his grave to the tune of a full barrel and a half of gunpowder. As colonial funerals began to become more detailed, hardline officials grew concerned. It must have seemed as if their vision of a city on a hill, famously referenced by big-name Puritan John Winthrop in a model of Christian charity, was crumbling before their eyes. In reaction to the changes, some enacted new rules to curb the funeral pomp. These included limits on bell tolling, which was justified as a loud, head-ringing bother for everyone in the community. It wasn't just that the increasingly fancy funerals were a bit too Catholic or continental either. Some colonial families risked bankruptcy by engaging in overly elaborate funerals, especially widows who were left with no breadwinner and a family that still needed food and shelter. To that end, by the middle of the 18th century, in many colonial settlements, officials began to enact sumptuary laws. These limited how much mourners could be charged for funeral services, capped prices for mourning wear, and penalized anyone who went overboard with gifts and booze at the wake. Understandably, grieving family and friends might want a remembrance of their lost loved one. While today we might look fondly at photographs or even claim a keepsake or two, colonial funeral attendees expected something more. By the 18th century, those attending an upper-class funeral simply had to have gloves. Meant as a memorial keepsake, the gloves were paid for out of the deceased's estate and were typically handed out in a hierarchical fashion. The most important people, like close family, got theirs first. Sometimes other attendees wouldn't get gloves, while those who couldn't make it to the service would still receive their pair or some other remembrance in the mail. Still, others got their gloves ahead of time as an invitation to the funeral. The gloves were cherished and passed down amongst family for quite a long time. They were even a money-making opportunity for people like Boston minister Andrew Elliott, who received nearly 3,000 pairs of funeral gloves over his 32-year career, but sold some during the latter half of the 18th century. This wasn't merely an occasion for callow gift-grabbing either. In the William and Mary Quarterly, Stephen C. Bullock and Sheila McIntyre argue that the practice helped to build and reinforce social networks in the colonies. In a world where social standing and community support were vital, spending extra on funeral gloves could be a surprisingly big deal. Though gloves were a popular 18th century funeral souvenir, they weren't the only token a mourner might receive. Rings were also a popular way of commemorating the dead and might include decorations of coffins and skulls, or engraved lines such as "Death Parts United Hearts" or "Prepare for Death." Minister Andrew Elliott, already struggling with his massive funeral glove collection, had so many funeral rings that he also sold them off over time. Diarist Samuel Sewall had 57 funeral rings in his collection, while Salem Dr. Samuel Buxton reportedly had a tankard full of not-so-lovingly collected rings. Meanwhile, the wealthy Winthrop family handed out 60 pricey rings for Waitstill Winthrop's 1717 service. It wasn't just a matter of digging some rings out of a bag and handing them out to mourners at the service either. Families had to think carefully about who got what kind of ring, and who might get offended if they didn't receive a blinged-out bauble in line with their status. It all got to be so much that rings were among the gifts outlawed by a 1741 Massachusetts provincial enactment meant to curb excessive funeral spending. African people forcibly brought to the North American colonies to work as slaves first arrived in 1625 in New Amsterdam. By the time English settlers took over the colony and renamed it New York, a small community of free black people had formed there too. The funerals of the enslaved were subject to tight regulations as officials feared uprisings at social gatherings. Some communities limited the number of mourners allowed at black funerals, while others required passes. In 1687, Virginia, the Northern Neck region, even saw legislation that outlawed slave funerals entirely. However, the funeral traditions persisted well into the depths of the 19th century enslavement, indicating that earlier generations of enslaved people refused to let their traditions fall by the wayside. These included practices that can reasonably be linked back to African funeral rites. This included the practice of only allowing a small subset of people to wash a body, while everyone else strictly avoided touching remains until after this step was completed. Some individuals buried in what's now called the African Burial Ground in New York City were found with coins, beads, and shells in their coffins.
When the plot was rediscovered, experts estimated that over 15,000 people were buried there.
These graves perhaps spoke to the funeral traditions carried over from their ancestral homelands. Back in 1602, Peter de Maurice wrote that Akan-speaking people in what's now largely Ghana buried the dead with goods meant to help them in the next world. Class can be one of the most obvious signs that mark some colonial dead from the rest. The richest could order fine stone or metal sarcophagi that contained well-made wooden coffins. Meanwhile, the poorest families might only be able to provide a shroud and a rented coffin that would go back to the parish church. Then there was the matter of race. Enslaved and free Africans and their descendants might be expected to be buried in cemeteries segregated on the basis of race. In Newport, Rhode Island, that might have been a spot known as God's Little Acre, which may have been the oldest grave markers for Africans in North America. These are especially notable as stone markings were costly, indicating that black families in Newport had access to both the money and skilled black stonemasons. In New Amsterdam, which would eventually become New York City, black community members could be buried in what's now called the African Burial Ground, the earliest known black cemetery in the country, with burials dating from the 1630s to 1795. However, there are occasional exceptions to the rule. Crispus Attucks, a man of black and indigenous heritage who was killed in the March 5, 1770 Boston Massacre, was laid to rest in Boston's Granary Burying Ground along with the likes of Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, and John Hancock. Not everyone was accorded a memorial or even a proper burial as the colonists saw it. For anyone believed to have violated the most closely held rules of a community, a simple grave offered too much respect. Instead, they were subject to what's sometimes called a deviant burial, in which normal burial practices are almost entirely ignored. In other societies, this might include ritualized violence enacted on a corpse, as when someone drove a stake into the remains of a suspected vampire, or a person who died by suicide was buried at a crossroads and not a church-sanctioned graveyard. In colonial America, the most notorious examples of deviant burials belong to the victims of the Salem witch trials.
We have found the witch! May we burn her? Who do you know she is a witch? She looks like one!
Though there is no official record of what happened to the people who were falsely accused of witchcraft and then hanged, they almost certainly would have been left somewhere near the execution site on the outskirts of town. No one would have seriously proposed burial in a sanctioned graveyard like the town's Charter Street Cemetery. The local legend has it that family members of at least 3 of the victims went to the spot under cover of darkness to exhume the bodies of their loved ones and give them a secret burial elsewhere. By 1770, the average colonist was guzzling down about 3.5 gallons of alcohol a year, roughly twice as much as Americans today. That typically came in the form of homebrewed beer or cider, locally distilled whiskey, or pricey imported rum. And as some attendees of modern wakes already know, alcohol has long played a central role in the American funeral customs.
Let's wake him to God and hope that he gets to heaven at least an hour before the devil finds out he's dead.
Some colonial communities might have a pre-funeral wake with plenty of rum, followed by another boozy get-together after the burial. Just about everyone would get some sort of alcohol at their funeral, whether it was a humble couple of gallons of cider at a poor person's service or a presumably fully stocked bar at a minister's funeral, for which the bill was often footed by the church. Booze was a serious line item in a colonial funeral budget. One David Porter of Hartford, Connecticut, drowned in 1678. Records of his funeral indicate that his attempted rescuers and those who recovered his body were given an extra helping of liquor, while members of the inquest received 2 quarts of wine and a gallon of cider. For the funeral proper, 8 gallons and 3/4 of wine were set aside, as was a full barrel of cider. The bill is almost entirely alcohol-based, with Porter's shroud and coffin tacked on to the very end as if they were afterthoughts. While colonial mourners would go about procuring somber clothes, assuming they had the means to do so, they weren't the only ones getting dressed up for a funeral. Black cloths were sometimes draped over a pulpit where a minister would give his sermon, and bits of black ribbon wrapped around all sorts of gear to give an appropriately mournful aesthetic. A purpose-built bier meant to hold the coffin during a funeral was also draped in a dark fabric called a pall. Even homes could be wrapped in cloth to show that their occupants were in the depths of mourning. Around Hartford, Connecticut, mirrors, pictures, and various tchotchkes around well-to-do homes were covered in cloth for a funeral. Some Philadelphians even went so far as to wrap their shutters in black cloth for up to a year. In 1759, the family of military commander Sir William Pepperell wrapped just about everything in their house in dull black fabric, including family portraits that were temporarily hidden from view. In stark contrast with old-school Puritan funerals where hardly a word was said, later colonial deaths drove people to acts of poetry. Sometimes these were appropriately somber tributes in verse form, while others took this time as an occasion for making puns and sharing bits of doggerel. After the 1710 death of 19-year-old Mary Garish, Puritan poet John Danforth wrote that she was surely in heaven. However, you grieve, the time so short, but yet, had you enjoyed her longer, the bands of love had faster grown, and bands of grief much stronger. Danforth's funeral verse for Garish was packed full of metaphor and sunny images of paradise, to be sure, but also came with a tinge of old Puritanism. Sermons, a more acceptable form of poetry for some, were sometimes printed for later reference. Reportedly, they were sent out with black borders and a bare skull or another form of a death's head, in case any of the readers didn't quite get the message. In colonial America, just about everyone was buried, but where one was buried depended on several factors. In larger cities like Boston, elites might be buried beside or even beneath the floor of a major church. Smaller communities might have a common burial ground or churchyard associated with a house of worship. In Williamsburg, Virginia, free and enslaved black people established the First Baptist Church in 1776.
A courageous group of enslaved and free blacks defied the law to gather for evangelical worship with an itinerant black preacher named Moses.
Besides worshiping there, parishioners also buried their dead nearby. A modern excavation uncovered evidence of at least 63 burials next to the original church as of 2023. Meanwhile, the rural dead might be placed in small family plots right on the farm, leaving the deceased resting fairly close to home in a quiet section of the property. For much of the colonial era, death was a domestic affair. Instead of hospitals, senior homes, or hospices, people usually died at home, leaving family members to manage the body and arrange for a funeral service. Who did what was often decided based on gender. Women were often tasked with caregiving. After someone's death, that meant cleaning and dressing the body, a duty that could include both immediate family and community members like neighbors and the local midwife. They would also prepare clothes for the burial, including a loose open-backed garment commonly called a shroud, as well as more common clothing items like stockings and soft shoes. In more urban areas, women might even work as quasi-professional layers out of the dead. Women would also be expected to take part in funeral processions and put together a meal and drinks for the living who attended services and wakes. Meanwhile, men would have gotten to work crafting the coffin, a simple container that was often put together by a local carpenter or cabinet maker. While woodworking was very much a male-dominated field, so too was the religious side of things. From church caretakers known as sextons to the minister conducting the service, men would have taken on the public religious duties of the funeral. They would have also taken on much of the physical labor, such as digging the grave and transporting the coffin from church to the burial ground. In contrast to earlier Puritan affairs that were all about getting listeners into a quivering state of anxiety over imminent hellfire, later colonial funerals were quite a bit cheerier, comparatively speaking. For example, funeral sermons gave ministers a chance to boost Christian doctrine by talking about the deceased's good example. Further into the 18th century, mourners were more likely to focus on comforting scenes of their loved ones in heaven, and they were more likely to expect to meet up with their loved ones after death, as hellfire became less of a given and the Calvinist notion of predestination was less prevalent. Graveyards soon reflected this change. Stark death heads carved into gravestones were replaced by willows and classically inspired urns. Meanwhile, the text carved onto the stones began to more obviously reference souls, implying that something of the dead continued on in a happy afterlife, where they waited for their still living family to join them one day. Even Cotton Mather, the big-name Puritan minister who was entrenched in the old ways of doing things, changed with the times. In his 1704 sermon for the funeral of Sarah Leverett of Boston, he spoke to the deceased woman's exemplary piety and comforted mourners with a final image of her entering heaven where God has there wiped all tears from her eyes. We must have them on ours till our arrival thither after.